Hey there, Yarn Life.
Good morning.
Woohoo! I am so excited for today's episode. I think I might learn something too. So thank you guys so much for joining us here at the Yarn Life Show for your daily dose of fiber. I'm your host today. And be sure you subscribe to this channel so that you can get notifications on every episode and get tangled up in our fun, upbeat, educational Facebook group that's dedicated to the hanks, skeins, balls, and cake that we love the most and the people who make the most of them, because yarn is life. I think after 11 episodes, I'm starting to memorize this. I'm getting better.
I love that we have an intro. Yeah, it keeps me on track.
Yeah. So today's episode is sponsored in part by you amazing people. Check out our Yarn Life swag shop to pick up a token tee, tote, or mug today. Every purchase you make there not only gives you great products that you'll love, but it also helps us to create more great episodes and bring on more amazing guests. So you can find our shop link in the show notes section after this episode airs today. And then today's episode is also sponsored by the American Crochet Association. The American Crochet Association is your personal journey to crochet mastery. This one-of-a-kind community offers a 12-course program that's easily managed with one new lesson every week. They focus on crochet education that builds knowledge and skills, helping crocheters to help themselves. I'm so excited about today's show. This is episode 11, and we're going to cover a topic that we all know is important, but may not give as much thought or effort to as it deserves. We're talking about gauge and size. So not bothering ourselves to follow gauge. It's not really our fault as yarn lovers, because gauge can be so tedious, confusing, and time consuming, and it's not even your actual project, which is kind of disheartening. I think most of us like to actually just jump into the project itself. So this episode will outline the difference between gauge and size, shedding light on some small tips and tricks you can follow to understand gauge and how it can help make your next project a success. So today our guest is Selena, founder and host of the ACA, and she is here to talk us through this topic. And I'm really excited because, confession, I'm totally one of those people who really doesn't bother with gauge, and sizing things or worrying about sizes kind of gives me anxiety. So Selena, can you tell us exactly what gauge is and how gauge is different from size?
Yeah, so thank you for hosting this episode today, Jess. It's always nice to chat with you, especially on the Yarn Life show. So thank you for hosting today.
Well, thanks for being here.
Absolutely. I love chatting about this stuff. So what is gauge and what is size? A lot of people think that they're exactly the same thing, or that's, just kind of insert gauge for size and insert size for gauge, but they're two totally different things. So whenever you see a pattern, whenever you're following a pattern instructions and you see something like gauge is XYZ equals 4 inches and XYZ equals 4 inches. So many stitches equals this certain amount, and so many rows equals this certain amount. And really what that pattern is telling you is that if you are making something, whatever it is, that it has taken a section of that pattern, and that is the gauge. So how that differs from size is if your tension, if your stitch work is going to match the gauge indicated in the pattern, then whatever size you're following, say you're making an Afghan, it's supposed to be 80 inches long. If your gauge matches the gauge in the pattern, then by nature, your size, your finished size will match the size in the pattern. And that goes for anything. It can go for hats or blankets or pillows or whatever it is that you're making. So gauge is the actual stitch count per inches and the row count per inches. And that's what you want to meet so that you can follow the size indicated in the pattern. So that's the difference between the two.
Gotcha. So we can kind of think of gauge as a ruler to kind of check our work against and make sure that our ruler matches up with the designer's ruler so that we wind up with the same size.
Yeah,
right?
Actually, that's a great way of putting it. I would have never thought about that. But yes, you're absolutely right. So you want to match the tension, basically. You want to use the right yarn, the right hook, so that your tension, your stitch tension is going to match the gauge so that, yes, so that it is the appropriate ruler so that you can follow the size as intended.
Gotcha. Awesome. So when does gauge matter? And for what types of projects should we bother with gauge, or should we be extra cautious about our gauge?
Sure, sure. So gauge is going to matter specifically on items that you need to be a certain size. And so that is going to be, say you're making a hat and it's a newborn hat. Well, gauge is going to matter because the size is going to matter. You want it to be exactly 12 inches for that newborn. You don't want it to be 13 or 14 or 15 or 10 or 9. So it's going to matter for things that have to fit a certain way or have to be a certain size. And that's where you really want to make sure that your gauge is going to match the gauges listed in the pattern so that you can make that size effectively.
Gotcha. The first time I ever, this is sad, the first time I ever actually made a gauge swatch was when I was knitting my first pair of socks. Mm-hmm. And I didn't, even then, even though I knew that I wanted the socks to fit my feet when I was done with them, I still resisted the idea of making a gauge swatch. But I was I was following this challenge, and, you know, that was the first day of the challenge. And I was like, well, everybody else is doing it, so I guess I'll, and I did want to make sure that they fit. And so I knit a small swatch, and I remember just being really excited that I made my gauge the first time around. Mm-hmm. So do you have any tips for, you know, what to do when you don't meet gauge? So what does it look like if you have too few stitches in the space allowed, or too many?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's definitely some things you can do to match gauge. So I love that scenario. You were making a sock and everybody else's, you know, before you just dive into the thing that you're making, it's good to pause and make some kind of swatch to make sure that your gauge matches the pattern so that you make the size that you want to make. So yeah, there's definitely some things to check as you're making the swatch. You do want to use the same yarn as indicated in the pattern. If you're not using the exact same brand and style and fiber and all of that, it's best to use something similar. And by similar, I don't mean, well, they're using weight 4, so I'm going to use a weight 4, because really there's a wide array of weight 4 of yarns within the subclass of the weight 4 category. So that's what I mean by you have to match the exact same yarn, not just by its weight category, but by its weight subclass. You have to use the same hook as was used in the pattern to make gauge. So you really have to try to replicate all of the same elements with all the same materials and all the same tools as was used to make that gauge. So if it's not panning out, because that was your question, if it's not panning out after you've done those things, then you can make small adjustments. You know, look back to the yarn that you're using. If you're trying to substitute, if you're not using the exact same yarn, then find a closer substitute. And that's where you can go to wraps per inch, and that's a whole other segment. But that's where, you know, look that up if you don't know what that means, because really that can be important, especially in yarn substitution, because your yarn may be too thin than the yarn that was used, or it may be too thick than the yarn that was used. So go back to that and make sure that your yarn is matching as close as possible. Take a look at the hook that you're using. Now, a lot of people just don't really pay attention to that, and they're surprised that, oh, you mean my G is not the same as an H? Well, I know that everybody knows there's a difference between a G and an H, but some people just go, my yarn says use an H, even though the pattern calls for a G, whatever, I'll just make it work. But, you know, that little difference in a small area really adds up in a big area. So really make sure that your hook is matching up. Another thing to look at is tension. Now, sometimes tension really varies for people. For example, I may crochet tighter than you crochet, Jess, because maybe I have a tighter tension than you do. So my stitches are going to be smaller if I crochet tighter. Or maybe my tension is much more relaxed than yours, which means my stitches are going to be bigger because my tension is more relaxed. So that's another thing that you can look at, so you don't have to make such drastic changes if you're using the exact same yarn, if you're using the exact same hook as the pattern that you're following. It may just be how tightly or how loosely you crochet. So those are some quick things, or those are some immediate things that you can look at if your gauge is not matching. So swatch, always start with that before you start with the project. Make sure you're using all the same materials, all the same, the same yarn, the same hooks. Hook, not hooks. You're using 2 hooks. That may be the problem.
That may be a problem.
I'm using 2. And make sure that and if you're using all the same exact if you're using all the same exact things and it's still not matching up, it could just be your tension. So it could just be that if you practice that swatch a little bit, maybe add a few more rows, maybe add a few more stitches, and you really pay close attention to your gauge matching, then you could just kind of force your muscle memory into making the size that you need, or matching the gauge that you need to match.
Interesting. I think there's so many components that go into it. So like I have a very mechanical mind. So like I like to think about those kinds of things and the differences that it can make to just use a different size hook, or just kind of pay attention to your tension a little more, or using a different yarn. And I have to say, I know when I first started crocheting, I didn't really understand weights very well at all. And I kind of lived in, worsted weight category. But I didn't realize that there were so many differences between different worsted weight yarns. I remember, now I know a lot of people hate this yarn, but I was a big fan of Caron Simply Soft.
Oh yeah.
And because it was soft and it was shiny, and I was new, and I'm like, yeah, it's pretty, and it came in pretty colors and all that kind of stuff. And because I buy my yarn based on color, totally. Yes. But I remember a few times I wanted to do some amigurumi or like things with color work, and the way that particular yarn behaved was so different, even though it's considered a worsted weight yarn, than something like a Red Heart or a Loops and Threads or something like that. And I remember being so confused. Obviously, like I knew, like I could see the difference between them, but I was like, well, why are they both called worsted then? Like, who named this a worsted weight yarn if it doesn't match up with the other ones? And so I think it's really interesting to take a bunch of different worsted weight yarns and kind of see the differences between them, and understand that they're all going to have a different, different value, different features for different projects, based on what you're doing. Amanda says, oh, Caron Simply Soft is the worst.
It's so funny that you either love it or hate it. And I wanted to point out, you were almost apologetic about liking Caron Simply Soft.
Because I remember the first time I brought it up in front of a bunch of other crocheters, and they were all like, oh, you use Caron Simply Soft? And I was like, what do you mean? It's great.
I know. Well, I liked it for a short time. I had never used it before. And the first time I used it, I love this segue we're on, actually.
Yeah.
The first time I'd seen it in a store, I was like, ooh, it is shiny and it's soft, and look at all these colors. And so I bought like 10, 12 different colors, and I made a few things with it. But then after I used it for a while, I was like, this is not my favorite. And I gave it all away.
Yeah, it definitely, it has its uses, but those uses are very, very few and far between. And I really haven't found any need to use them in the past few years. So yeah, Jackie says that's why I love making amis. Gauge for the most part isn't important. Yeah, it is. That is one of the reasons why I like making amigurumi too, because it's just fun to kind of see what happens, see what comes of it. Yes, Amanda, chain 10 and throw in the fireplace. That's fantastic.
Amanda, you're so funny. I love that.
That's perfect.
I think just in case I was laughing and you guys couldn't hear, Amanda says chain 10 and throw it in the fireplace. And Caron, if you're listening, we're sorry. We love everything else that you do, but the Caron Simply Soft, we just don't love it with all of our hearts. That's all we mean by this. And
I love the way it looks. Yeah. I love the colors that it comes in. I love all of those things. It just doesn't work out very well. All right. So now that we've kind of covered why gauge is important, what it actually is, and the difference between gauge and sizing, I'm curious. Can you tell us about your current course at the ACA, Sizing Mastery? I think that's what you guys are doing right now.
Yeah, absolutely. So the ACA is the 12-course program that we were talking about just a minute ago, and it's a learning path for crocheters to build their knowledge and skills. And a very important thing that crocheters have got to, nail down is about sizing, is about sizing mastery. So many, just for example, on my own personal crochet page last night, I threw out a question if anybody struggled with hat sizing. And I have this one really cute picture of this hat that I had modeled, and it was too big of a size for the model. And so she puts it on and it's covering her eyes, but it's a really cute picture. It's really cute. And so I use that picture specifically when I talk about size, and I ask people, hey, do you guys have any questions about size? Send me a message if you do. I had over a dozen people private message on my page since last night. It's been like a little over 12 hours. And they're like, yeah, I struggle with size. This is a huge issue, even on that level, even on the level of you're making something small like a hat. And people are like, man, it's either too big or it's too small, and I just can't get this right. So this course that I've developed at the ACA is all about understanding the fundamentals of sizing, understand that there is a difference between gauge and size. And so we do talk about that specifically. But there's some other elements that I think are really fun pertaining to this class. So I'm going to segue again just for a little bit, because a lot of people are like, okay, I got gauge, I got size, those things make sense. But another question I have is all about this repeat thing, because sometimes, and Jess, I don't know, of course you've seen it. I'm like, I don't know if you've seen it. Of course you've seen it.
I don't know what you're talking about. I have no clue.
Who are you talking to, Selena? No, it's all about the repeats, is that you find a stitch pattern that you love, and you're following a pattern and it shows you the stitch pattern. You're like, man, I love this, but I would so love to make something else with it. And they're kind enough to give you the repeat, like, this pattern is done in multiples of 12 plus 6 times a bucket of chicken, or that's what it is. Because people look at this and they're like, I don't know what the 6 times 3 plus 4, like, what does that mean?
Right.
So our course also kind of breaks down this whole repeat thing, because there's a stitch repeat and then there's a row repeat. And then understanding those different multiples are going to help you take this beautiful stitch design that you love, and it helps you to resize it so that you can make other things that you love too. And yeah, so also this course is geared towards tackling a variety of different things. So it doesn't matter if you want to make hats or any kind of wearable, cowls, socks, boot cuffs, wrist warmers, Afghans, sweaters. It doesn't matter what you want to make in the crochet world. This course is geared towards understanding fundamentals that affect size and how to navigate through meeting gauge, so that you can effectively make anything with greater confidence and success.
I love that. I think it's so important to have those kinds of things in your toolbox.
Yeah.
Because I know I'd so much rather spend time doing the whole gauge swatch thing and figuring out the sizing the right way. And if you think of it as kind of preventing getting to the end of your project and realizing that you're off, how frustrating that can be to get all the way to the end of a project and have been so excited about the entire creation of the thing, and then kind of realize once you've put all this hard work into it that it's not what you wanted, it doesn't fit, it's not the right size, whatever that looks like. And I think I like to think of it now that I'm getting better at doing the whole gauge thing. I like to think of it as preventing that feeling of that, oh, I just spent all that time, and now you either have to live with it wrong or give it away or whatever, or you have to start all over again. Yeah, which can be really disheartening. So I think taking the time to learn and understand these concepts obviously can not only prevent a lot of kind of sadness when you wind up with a project that doesn't work, but it's an extra tool in your arsenal, you know, something that you can do with confidence. And I think that's important.
Absolutely. Well, also, I think that it just gives crocheters a lot of confidence and power, because there's still a lot of people who will see pictures of things, and I see it all the time, and that's why I developed this course. They're like, oh, I love that bag. I wish I could make things like that, but mine would never turn out. Or I wish I could make that hat, but mine would never turn out. Like, I never understand how to make it match that. And
Right.
really, the root of a lot of those is just not understanding how gauge and size works, not understanding that the yarn you choose matters, not understanding that just a very few slight changes in things like your tension, the hook you're using, the yarn you're using could make all the difference, so that when you do see that picture of that thing that you really love, if you want to make it, you're not going to be hindered by, oh, mine would never turn out like that. You're going to have some
Right.
confidence in that. Okay, I know how to tackle that. And if it's, I know what to do to test the different elements and features that this pattern has, so that when I go to actually make the thing, you know, I'm going to be successful.
I love that. Well, thank you so much, Selena, for helping us and me understand gauge and sizing a little better and feel a little more confident about the whole situation, because it's definitely something that we shouldn't forget about and just kind of leave to the side. Amanda calls it preventative maintenance. I love that. I think
Oh,
that's perfect.
all of it today. We need to have you back on the show.
Yes. All right, so what's next? Please join us on Facebook to vote for our next feature episode. We have a poll available for votes and new entries. It's open every week. The Yarn Life show will be featured in seasons, and we have 3 episodes left in our first season, season 1. So find our Facebook group link in the show notes and vote on that poll today. And remember, today's episode is sponsored in part by you. Please check our Yarn Life swag store to pick up a token tee, tote, or mug today. Please check out the mug. I designed the mug. It's hilarious. It's great.
It's great.
Total plug for my own mug. That rhymes. Every purchase you make there helps us to create more great content, more episodes, and bring on even more amazing guests. So find our shop link in the show notes section today. Thank you for joining this episode of the Yarn Life Show. For your daily dose of fiber, we will see you next Wednesday at the same time.
That's right.
Bye, guys.
Bye. Peace, guys. Have a great day.